Does look good in the light though.
Yeah, it just looks like I mean it's a juice bomb. it's what it. I mean that's kind of where when we think about where NEIPAs kind of started from, no one called them NEIPAs until they got pissed off at the West Coast. We're just like, no, like they're not hazy, juicy IPAs. They're not cloudy. I mean, I guess they were called hazies first, right? Hazy IPAs
For sure.
and then they were like, no, like West Coast American IPAs are like West Coast. Your Sierra Nevada, your malt driven, dry, crisp. But yeah, the West Coast were like dry, crisp. West Coast are crisp. They're not hazy. You can pretty much see through, even though they're amber in color. West Coast, like they should be, because they use a lot of crystal malts and caramel malts in there. Whereas the NEIPAs came along, they're like, no, we're not going to do any of that. Like, we're not going to filter our beer. We're going to use a different yeast profile, and more than that, we're just going to showcase all of these new world hops that were coming up. Your Galaxy, Mosaic, Citra, Strata, and you can't forget Eldorado or Azucar as well, because at the start, Eldorado, those ones were like kind of at the, it's like, what, these beers, these New England IPAs showcase these hops, and then I guess by around 2010, 12, like from Vermont to Massachusetts, that area where New England started, there were brewers that were like, and I really think it was just we want to differentiate ourselves from the West Coast because we're making an IPA on the East Coast, so we're going to call it an East Coast IPA. And they're like, no, it actually started in New England, so we should. I can't remember which brewery first started calling it a New England IPA, because you have Alchemist that were doing the Heady Topper back in 2003-4, and that was just described as like an ale, but it was a double IPA that was hazy as could be, and it was just a juice bomb. But I'm pretty sure it was a Massachusetts brewery, Trillium? No, I can't remember which one first called it a NEIPA. But yeah, since then, everyone makes them. I don't actually know the statistics on this, but I would say that New England IPAs, hazy IPAs, juicy IPAs, what's another synonym for these cloudy IPAs, milkshake IPAs? That would probably be the most popular style for craft beer breweries to brew now. Like, instead of brewing your traditional IPA or a West Coast IPA, they are all so hazy and hop driven in the late hop, not in the boil hop, that I would hazard a guess that easily over 50% of IPA sales are hazy.
Oh,
I don't know that. I'm just hazarding a guess.
I'd agree. I'd definitely agree. And there's been, as far as hazies go, it's a generalised kind of style. Because they've become more and more popular over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I remember brewing, like myself, brewing 2010, 12, and we were all making hazy IPAs, but we weren't calling them New England IPAs. You call them a juice bomb. When they come out, and you're putting no hops in the boil. Like, you're not, maybe in the Whirlpool, maybe a little bit, but you're really accentuating when your fermentation starts, and you start. I remember doing over 10 gram a litre, easy.
Yeah.
And even then, back then, you're just like, oh, this is a lot of hops to use as a dry hop. But then the flavours that came out of it were tropical, fruit forward. You had low perceived bitterness, and perceived visually, you had a cloudy, hazy beer that really tasted like a freshly squeezed juice. That's how my beers turned out.
And it's not a bad problem.
And then I realised by about 2015 that they were kind of calling them in certain beer judging in certain circles. They were calling them hazies. They were calling them New Englands, and it wasn't until about 2018, 2019 that the BJCP, the Beer Judges Companion, where we all get our style guides, well, not all of us, but I get my style guides from, decided to call it to give it a style. So then we had a West Coast IPA in America, and we had a New England IPA. So that was when it was kind of solidified in a beer judging capacity to go like, this is how we differentiate these two beers.
And I think that's the point when they really started to diverge from one another as well. Like the West Coast to especially the Northeast Coast, the actual finished product and the kind of average beer that they're producing is completely different now.
Now they are, and I remember drinking hazies at the time. I mean, Heady Topper from Alchemist is probably a good example because that was a double IPA, and it was the IBUs weren't low in that one. The perceived bitterness was there, but then the hop aroma that came out of it was something completely different from a West Coast. And when you poured it, even though I've only drunk the Heady Topper half a dozen times, they're hard cans to get a hold of. Fun fact, I remember reading about it years and years ago that at the time that Heady Topper was being made, there was literally people lining and driving up to the brewery to get as much as they could of this beer. I don't know how much credence to give this story, but it's been one that's told like 100 times or more, that the beer was that popular. You had people lining up and driving up to get, I think the allocation was like 2 cases or something, and just kept selling out of this beer. And I think by like symbiosis, I guess it is, that the beer style became popular. I think a lot of people on the West Coast at the time, the brewers were like, this isn't a real style of IPA. It's unfiltered. You're using the wrong hops, but it was an IPA nonetheless. If you know how it's brewed, and then because they became so popular, it was like, well, we have to call it something. We can't keep calling this a hazy or just a East Coast thing. So that's where the New England IPA came from. And this is a good show of it. This is a beer from Ambush Brewing here in Canberra, who I'm joined by one of the brewers here. Axel, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
This beer is called Enter the Nectar Dome. Why is it called Enter the Nectar Dome? Tell me a little bit more about why it's called Enter the Nectar Dome.
Well, we for whatever reason, we wanted to go with a kind of Mad Max theme. We were thinking it was kind of out there. We were doing something a little bit different with the style. It's the first time we've brewed a NEIPA on our equipment, so we wanted to kind of go big or go home, so to speak.
Right.
So we were kind of experimenting a little bit. We used some Pomona yeast. It's a brand new yeast from Lallemand. It's a hybrid IPA yeast from the US.
So a hybrid IPA yeast, for those that don't really know what a hybrid yeast is, can you tell us a little bit more about what makes a hybrid yeast and why would you use it for a beer like this? That's just a compressor. Don't worry, nothing's exploding.
I've never heard that before.
You see the look in your face. It's like, what's going on?
It's a keg exploding.
It's just
I was like, that's a keg exploding for sure.
Oh no, keg would be a lot louder than that. We digress. We go to hybrid yeast.
A hybrid yeast, yeah. My understanding is this yeast is a hybrid between some UK IPA strains and an IPA strain from the east coast of the US. We use quite a few hybridized strains actually in a few brews that we do. Another one is Nova Lager, which is a classic homebrew yeast that we've found excellent success with.
And this is what you've made the Pilsner and the lager out of.
Pacific Lager. I think you've still got a few kegs of that one.
Certainly do have a few kegs of that one. I might hold on to them for a little bit longer.
Yeah. So that's had a good time now to kind of relax a little bit. It's turned out excellently. And we've also got a New Zealand Pilsner in the works as well, using the Nova Lager. But generally, the kind of hybridized yeast, kind of the best of both worlds. You've got high esterification in this Pomona yeast for what it is, but also an excellently attenuating yeast. So we've got really kind of low ABV. Technically, this would be a low-carb NEIPA, which I'm not sure anyone's really done before. I've not heard of one anyway.
No, well, normally with NEIPAs, we want those high protein grains in there to give hops and alcohol something to kind of marry together, and that's how I not everyone. That's how I look at beer. You kind of need to balance things out. You need to balance malt with fermentation, and then also have your hop profile come in, and the water marries all of that together. So I'm interested in why you would choose a hybrid yeast for a New England IPA. I would assume because the style was kind of born from using UK yeasts.
It was.
Without that, I mean, they were making a British IPA, but the only ingredient they were using out of a British IPA recipe without using American ingredients was the yeast.
Yeah,
which will throw out British yeasts are renowned for well, their ale yeasts are renowned for lots of esters, lots of fruity esters, and attenuating to a point which leaves enough sugars to give the beer still some body. So I suppose with this one, where the sugars have been pretty much all the time, they've all been eaten. Not all of them, but
a good proportion of them.
If we were talking about a percentage, it would be high 90s.
Yes, yeah. I couldn't give you the number off the top of my head, but yeah.
But for attenuation, that is quite high for this style of beer, which I guess gives you the ability to kind of showcase the hops a bit more.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. And so with the Nectaron, obviously, as Paul mentioned before, we hardly did any boil additions. We did a Whirlpool addition and a 10-minute addition at the end, just using some high alpha Victoria, which is one of our favourites.
So you Whirlpooled with Victoria?
Whirlpooled with Victoria. Okay. Not a lot. Enough to try and get a bit of the bitterness to start, because we knew that the bitterness wouldn't necessarily be there because we were doing a fairly cold ferment and a fairly cold hop addition for the Nectaron. So we wanted to get a bit of that bitterness to start and make sure that there was some there, because that is one of the classic examples in NEIPA of what you're wanting to expect is at least a fair bit of bitterness. This one, I think the bitterness is there. It's dropped down a little bit, interestingly.
We were just talking about that before we were shooting, how the perceived bitterness or the bitterness to both of us from when we first tried it at the brewery to now has mellowed to me substantially. And has showcased brings the hops really to the forefront.
It does.
And the Nectaron on this one, how much were you using in the dry hop?
The dry hop, we used 5 kilo dry hop of Nectaron in a 650 litre batch, which is...
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
And at what point of fermentation were you... Because there's a few different ways to get the hop haze in a NEIPA. Contrary to what a lot of people might think, the haze doesn't come... It's not a protein haze, and it's not really a yeast haze either. Well, therefore, it shouldn't be. The haze in a NEIPA should come from the hops. And the way that you get that is by adding it at certain times during fermentation. I think the standard way of doing a NEIPA would be to get your hops, get your fermentation to like high Krausen, and split it in two and do like a 3-day hop and then like a 6-day hop, or like a 2-day hop and a 4. So you split it in half. Or you could do it into 3 parts, but usually you'll wait for fermentation to kickstart. Yeah. You have a Krausen to put the hops in, and there's a reason for that, which is biotransformation.
Exactly.
Biotransformation is the ability for, in the act of fermentation and putting the hops in, creating esters and flavours that usually wouldn't be there. That's where we get all these tropical fruit flavours for. If you use these hops after fermentation has completed, you're not going to get that biotransformation, and you're also not going to get that haze. So using Nectaron, where did you use it in the fermentation?
This one we did a 3 kilo addition at I believe it was the 3rd day. That was basically peak fermentation. This thing rocketed. It really rocketed. That yeast was incredible. And on the 5th day, we were down already at 1008.
How much pressure was it at 3 days?
At 3 days, we were only running it at 0.4 of an atmosphere.
So not much, but enough to keep...
Exactly. Keep the pressure in. And then as we transferred back into the main fermenter, we added our final addition of the 2 kilos of the Nectaron, and we knocked that up to 0.7 from there. And that really brought that hop creep and that esterification forward. And we could smell it. Like the next time I walked into the brewery, it was like I was walking through an orchard. It was a really incredible smell. Unfortunately,
Well, I wish we had smell-o-vision because it smells absolutely amazing. Nectaron, I guess by namesake, you could hazard a guess of what the main aromas should be. And yes, nectarine is there, but there's also I get ripe peach. Ripe peach is there, like white peach. That sweet skin I'm picking up on. There's also a little bit of, as what you'd expect in NEIPAs, that passion fruit pulp. It's not really the skin of it; it's the pulp. That thing, orange peel. I mean, and you look at it, it catches the light so well. And NEIPAs shouldn't be murky. I've tried. I have personally tried, and I've personally made a lot of NEIPAs that get a little bit viscous on the tongue, and that's usually because I've not watched what I was doing with the hops, and I've created a little bit of hop burn, which creates a viscous, a slick on the tongue. You don't want that in this style of beer at all, and this one is a brilliant showcase of it. You put your nose in there, and it's just like ripe fruits.
Very ripe.
There's a lovely sweetness, as we were talking about before. I was like, what are the other adjunct malts you kind of put into this beer that might have given it a color change or a sweetness or a malt backbone that is really standing out?
Precisely. So in a lot of ways, it's quite a standard bill or grain bill for this kind of style. We have big amount of wheat, big amount of malted oats. But in this case, instead of your kind of classic crystal malts, we went for a toffee malt, and that's a little bit unusual. And that was kind of a happy accident because we couldn't get the original malt that we were looking for.
And you've already got the brew day locked in.
Brew day locked in, so we thought, look, we'll go down to our local brew shop and see what they can bring up for us in the short term, and they gave us some excellent toffee malt.
And what was the percentage of your grain bill that was toffee malt?
Toffee malt, it would have been about 5%. Not a big addition, just enough to give it that kind of backbone that you were talking about.
And enough to change the colour.
Enough to change the colour slightly.
That golden hue that comes through there. We've just got the afternoon light coming through. You can see it. It's beautiful. It doesn't give off the murky haze. It really captures the light and slime. It shines.
It's a peachy kind of colour, really, at the end of the day, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's Nectaron and peach, as I said, they're the two flat. That's what I pick up on without, like, even with my eyes closed, if I was doing that, they're the flavours that I'm coming. Then I open my eyes, I see the colour, and then my mind goes kind of a different way, and I start to think, is it the sweetness from the malts that I'm picking up on? But because of the attenuation,
I don't think so.
It's probably not.
I think we just we nailed the hop additions.
So Victoria
was a very, very small amount in the world, but 15-minute edition and then a Whirlpool edition at 80 degrees. I think we used like 800 grams maybe of Victoria, and that was just not much at that stage in the boil. It's really not much.
So at 10 minutes, Whirlpool 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. I think maybe that's where some of that passion fruit is coming from.
I was just going to say, where is that coming from? Victoria is renowned, especially later in the boil. If you add it at the start, you're not going to get that. Those beta acids will kind of probably shine through. The alpha acids, I think, because what I'm smelling in this is like a whole bunch of alpha acids that are putting basically the only thing that I pick up on more than anything is the tropical fruits from the Nectaron. It's
tangerine-ish, I think, as well. There's a hint of like blood orange. It's not as strong as it was.
Well, I was definitely picking up on orange peel. So I guess that because it's not orange juice per se, even though it kind of has the appearance of orange juice. What I was smelling and tasting was definitely like the orange peel, like unfiltered orange juice. We have orange juice. You can read a book through, and then you get like a proper Australian orange juice. It's just like 50 oranges or whatever it is.
Pulp and all.
Pulp and all. Like that's what I'm getting, and there's nothing wrong with that. We call these beers juice bombs for a reason, and man, you've done very well here.
Yeah, I think we have as well. It's my favourite one that we've put out so far, and it's been extremely popular.
It has been very popular here. We've gone through 2 kegs in a fortnight, and we have another 2, or do we have another 1?
I think
we definitely have another
one.
Yeah,
I
definitely have another one. That's why we're doing a video on it, because I was really, there's not often beers that I drink and go like, I want to showcase this beer to let people know that an IPA is like, a lot of questions. I'm diverting here. A lot of questions that I get asked in people come in and they say, I don't like it. Like, I don't like IPAs. And the good thing now is like IPAs aren't just like, well, if you asked someone that 20 years ago, you'd be like, yeah, I get your point.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. It's like, IPAs, have you tried a cold IPA? Have you tried a West Coast IPA? Have you tried a milkshake IPA?
Steam
Have you tried a hazy? Have you tried a steam IPA? Champagne IPA. We could go on for
there's millions of them.
There's so many of them, and I love to get that question from people. It's just like, I don't normally drink IPAs, so then you can say like, what IPAs don't you like? And they've usually come up with. There's a few in Australia that come up every now and again, and you can kind of say like, well, that's an old, that's something like Little Creatures, so that's a very old style IPA. Like there's since they first made that beer, there's been another probably dozen IPAs added to the style guidelines. So if you don't like that, and I understand why someone might not like that bitter style of clean, crisp, malt-driven, not hop-driven IPAs, very much based on that traditional American style. And now you can, when someone asks me that, I can say, well, if you don't like that, then maybe you'll like a milkshake IPA. Maybe you'd like a fruited IPA. Fruited IPAs can be good.
Can be good.
Few and far between, but they can be good. I think when you have that much hops and that much fruit, they sometimes contradict each other. But if you add a lactose to that and fruit, then the lactose kind of like smooth them away. So if you don't like those bitter IPAs, there are a dozen other ones to choose from. And this is a really good example of one that is it's not a West Coast. It's not an American, it's not a British, it is a really good an Australian East Coast.
We'll call it an East Coast IPA.
Yeah, East Coast IPA.
Correct. And I think it's really interesting as well, Paul, that you're mentioning lactose, because I do get a real creaminess from this mouthfeel. I likened it to a yeast bar, like a mango yeast bar. Obviously that's got a bit of lactose in it, but there's no lactose in the beer.
Like when to me, when I drink, when I have beer that has lactose in it, I know because my tongue tells me that there's an oily slick.
Yeah.
That alcohol is trying the alcohol is trying to get through, but it won't.
Yeah.
So it just kind of coats your tongue, and that's what I was kind of saying to you before when we were having that conversation off camera. I was just like, oh, Axel, there's no lactose in this, is it? It's like, oh no. It's like, because I'd be very surprised. There is a perception of, and I think that just comes from high hops, alpha acids, and the alcohol. The
alcohol is definitely there, and it's not overwhelming, but it lets you know it's there, which is really what you want in an IPA generally. You don't want something.
I like my NEIPAs to be boozy. I like that because you can. When I say boozy, I like to taste and smell the alcohol. I want to know that I'm not drinking a 5% pale ale. I'm not drinking a 6% IPA. I'm drinking something that's between, what are other guidelines? 6 to 9%.
Yeah, 9% on a stretch.
Like I want to know that I'm drinking something that has alcohol in it. That's my personal opinion, subjectively, right? Like, but then as I said, I understand why some people will go like, I don't like that. I don't like IPAs because I don't like this one beer. And you're like, well. Let me educate you on, or like if you lend me your ear, to like I'll find you an IPA that is to your palate. Like,
well, there's plenty of them, and just because you've tried one IPA, that does not mean you've tried all IPAs. It's probably the most diverse beer group now.
Yes,
of any style, I would say.
Yeah, it would definitely in the craft beer industry. The way that IPAs have just been, and I think we can thank the accessibility of hops to go from one country to another. I like to there's some really good showcases in Australia and New Zealand as the difference between American Citra, New Zealand Citra, Australians. Mosaic, Australian Mosaic, Galaxy, New Zealand and Australian Galaxy.
Completely different.
Completely. I mean, you look at them and you're like, it's the same hop, but then you try them in different beers. You're like, no, these are even on the like, even when you quantize the alpha and the beta acids, like these are very, very different hop varietals. Even though they're pushing out the same aromas and flavors, 100%. The way that you can use them in a beer are completely different.
You can liken it a lot to wines and wineries. So if you're using the same grape, let's say a Shiraz from Italy is going to be absolutely completely different to a Shiraz in Australia. And it comes down to climate, comes down to water, comes down to soil, nutrients,
the terroir.
Kind of thing. Terroir.
We're not allowed to use that in the beer world.
But it is that same generalized kind of thought process that the plant is going to react to what it has. And regional, even regional in the sense that one state to the other in Australia will have completely different hops with the exact same varietal, with a completely different aroma, completely different settings, really.
Even on the East Coast, hops grown in the north and hops grown in Tasmania, which I guess is you'd complete and they're growing like they literally brought them over and like they're the same hop, but 15 years later, if you try these hops and put them in beer, they are perceivably different. And I think this is where the NEIPAs really showcase themselves, because NEIPAs is a beer style born from people, from craft brewers and home brewers wanting to experiment with new hops and different malt varieties. And West Coast really don't do that. English IPAs really don't. There's a strict parameter, I guess.
They're more strict.
Yeah, they're more strict. Whereas with a NEIPA, the guidelines are quite
open to interpretation.
Malleable, open to interpretation. Just like, myself personally, I've made IPAs that I wanted to be a double IPA, but attenuation didn't hit out, and you ended up with a 6% beer instead of an 8% beer. So you know that the yeast, so you dry hop at the end. Obviously not a NEIPA because you're dry hopping at the end, but you come up with a hazy bit of juice bomb, and then you think to yourself like, oh, I can do this better. And you make it again. So craft brewing, I think, had a lot to do with the birth of hazy IPAs, East Coast IPAs, I guess is what we're
experimental brewing.
Experimental brewing, and
that's what we like to do. And it was a once-off. We were just thinking this would be kind of an experimental crack at the style, but I think given how many people are kind of commenting on it and getting back to us
and enjoying it,
like including myself, I must add, I think we're going to have to do this one again. Maybe a few small alterations, but it came out extraordinarily well.
Being the ethos of Ambush is better every beer.
Exactly.
Better every beer. I'll get into that. What would you do differently? Because it's a pretty smacking beer. What would you do to? I'm intrigued by that as a brewer and as a beer.
I don't think there's much I would change with the grain bill. I think that's a solid base for the beer that we've got. I think probably what I'd look at doing is lowering the fermentation temp a little bit, like a degree, maybe 2.
Which doesn't sound like much, but when you're fermenting 2 degrees
is a big deal. Yeah. So this one, if I recall correctly, we fermented at 16 degrees. I think
is that because it was a hybrid yeast that you were trying to push it as low and to get as clean?
Yeah, we wanted clean fermentation because it was the first time we'd used yeast. Yeah. Hybrid IPAs and IPA yeast in general, they can be a bit temperamental, especially if you're fermenting at higher temps. I think what we'd like to do is try to keep a little bit more of the hop character the malt character, that a lot of that was lost in a lot of ways. So I think there could be a little bit more malt backing to kind of prop up that hop flavour a little bit more.
So we're going bigger and bolder.
Bigger and bolder. Maybe add 10% of the grain bill volume Same. I wouldn't change anything in regards to the volume. Get it up to that kind of 7.5% range.
We're at 6.5, 6.6.
6.6.
Yeah. So if you were to brew it again, it would be to make, as I said, make it bigger, bolder,
and boozier.
And I think on that note, we might leave you. Thank you for joining us again, Axel. Always a pleasure sitting down, having a beer with you, and just beer geeking.
Yeah.
With you, I hope you've learned something as well. We've touched on like the kind of history of NEIPAs, how they're made, why they're made, and why we enjoy them so much. So on that note,
Cheers again.
Cheers again.